Right now, somewhere in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, there's a massive container ship carrying about 20,000 containers. From a distance, it looks completely full, stacked high with those colorful steel boxes you see on every cargo ship. But here's what you don't see. Roughly 8,000 of those containers are completely empty. Nothing inside, just air. This ship is burning thousands of gallons of fuel per hour to transport empty metal boxes across the ocean. And this isn't some rare occurrence or shipping company mistake. This is how global trade actually works. According to industry data, approximately 40% of all containers moving around the world are empty. That's not a typo. 4 out of every 10 containers on the ocean right now contain absolutely nothing. They're just taking up space, burning fuel, and costing money. And what makes this so fascinating is that, by all accounts, this is completely insane. These containers cost $3,000 to $5,000 each. Ships cost hundreds of millions of dollars. Fuel costs are enormous. And yet, the entire system is designed around regularly moving billions of dollars worth of empty steel boxes around the planet. This is the hidden absurdity at the heart of global trade. To understand this, you first have to understand the fundamental problem that breaks the entire shipping system: trade imbalance. Global trade is not a two-way street. It's more like a massive highway with traffic going one direction and almost nothing coming back. Let's look at the numbers. China exports about $3.6 trillion worth of goods every year. The United States imports about $3.8 trillion worth of goods, but the US only exports about $2 trillion. Europe has a similar problem. They import far more from Asia than they export back. This creates a massive imbalance in container flows. Here's what this looks like in practice. A container leaves Shanghai packed full of electronics, furniture, toys, clothes, high-value manufactured goods heading to the United States. That container arrives in Los Angeles, gets unloaded, and now it needs to go back to Asia. But here's the problem. American companies aren't producing enough exports to fill all those containers going back. So what happens? The container either sits in Los Angeles waiting for cargo that may never come, or it gets loaded back onto a ship completely empty and sent back to China where it's actually needed. And this happens millions of times per year. The scale of this problem is staggering. According to container trade statistics, in 2023, approximately 60 million containers moved from Asia to North America and Europe. But only about 36 million containers moved back the other direction. That's a gap of 24 million containers. 24 million containers that had to be repositioned empty because there simply wasn't enough cargo going the other direction. That represents about 40% of total movements. And each of those empty containers still costs money to move. Fuel, labor, port fees, ship space, all cost with zero revenue. But there's a second layer to this problem that makes it even worse: regional imbalances. Even within Asia, containers pile up in the wrong places. Say you're a shipping company and you have 10,000 empty containers stuck in Los Angeles. Great, you need to get them back to Asia, but your manufacturing customers aren't evenly distributed. Maybe 60% of your business is in southern China, around Shenzhen and Hong Kong. Another 30% is in Vietnam, and 10% is in South Korea. But your ships returning from the US might go to Shanghai first. Now you have empty containers in Shanghai, but you need them in Shenzhen. So you have to pay to truck them or rail them hundreds of miles to the right location. More cost, more time, more inefficiency. This is why shipping companies have entire departments dedicated to something called empty container repositioning. These are logistics specialists whose only job is to figure out where empty containers are, where they need to be, and the cheapest way to move them. They use sophisticated algorithms and forecasting models to predict where future demand will be and pre-position empty containers accordingly. But even with all this planning, they're still moving massive numbers of empty boxes around because the fundamental trade imbalance can't be solved with software. Now, you might be wondering, if shipping empty containers is so expensive and wasteful, why don't they just leave them where they are and manufacture new ones where they're needed? Well, some companies actually do this. During the pandemic shipping boom in 2021, when container shortages were severe and shipping rates were sky high, It was sometimes cheaper to just abandon containers in North America and manufacture new ones in Asia rather than pay the premium rates to ship them back empty. But this only works in extreme market conditions. Under normal circumstances, repositioning empty containers is still cheaper than building new ones. Here's the math. A new 40-foot container costs about $3,500 to manufacture in China. Shipping that same container, empty from Los Angeles to Shanghai, costs about $800 to $1,200 depending on market rates. So, purely from a cost perspective, repositioning the empty container makes sense. But here's what that calculation ignores: opportunity cost. Every empty container taking up space on a ship is a container slot that could be used for paying cargo. And during peak seasons when ship space is tight, that opportunity cost becomes massive. Let's say a shipping company has 100 slots available on a ship returning from Los Angeles to Shanghai. They could fill all 100 with empty containers they need to reposition. That costs them about $100,000 in operating expenses, fuel, labor, port fees, and they make zero revenue. Or they could fill 70 slots with empty containers they desperately need to reposition, and use the remaining 30 slots for actual paying customers. Maybe American exporters shipping machinery, agricultural products, or chemicals to Asia. Those 30 paying containers might generate $60,000 in revenue. So now they're only losing $40,000 instead of $100,000. But they're also leaving 30 empty containers behind in Los Angeles, which creates a shortage in Asia and means they might need to manufacture new containers sooner. This is the constant balancing act shipping companies face. Move too many empties and you sacrifice revenue. Move too few empties and you create shortages that hurt your business. There's no perfect solution because the underlying problem, trade imbalance, is structural and can't be fixed by logistics alone. And this problem gets dramatically worse during economic cycles. During boom times, when consumer demand is high and imports are surging, containers flood into North America and Europe faster than they can be repositioned. This creates massive shortages in Asia, which drives up container prices and leads to manufacturing bottlenecks. During bust times, when demand collapses and imports slow down, suddenly there are too many containers in Asia and not enough in Western ports. The system is constantly overshooting in one direction or the other because it takes weeks to move containers across oceans, and demand can shift much faster than that. The 2021 to 2023 period is a perfect example. In early 2021, during the pandemic shipping crisis, there was a severe container shortage in Asia. Factories had orders but couldn't ship products because there weren't enough containers available. Shipping companies responded by manufacturing containers as fast as possible. About 6 million new containers that year, double the normal rate. They also increased rates for empty container repositioning to incentivize moving empties back to Asia faster. By late 2022, the shortage was resolved, but then demand crashed in 2023 as consumers pulled back spending. Suddenly, there were way too many containers in circulation, and they were all piling up in the wrong places, mostly in North America and Europe where demand had collapsed. This is when the empty container percentage spikes even higher. In 2023, some trade lanes saw empty container rates hit 50% or even 60% on return trips from North America to Asia. Ships were sailing back with more than half their capacity empty because there just wasn't enough export cargo to fill them. And shipping companies couldn't leave all those containers behind because they'd have shortages in Asia when demand eventually recovered. So they ate the cost and moved massive numbers of empty containers across the ocean at a loss. But there's a third dimension to this problem that most people never consider: container type mismatches. Not all containers are the same. There are standard dry containers, refrigerated containers, reefers, open-top containers, flat racks, tank containers, dozens of different types designed for different cargo, and they're not interchangeable. If you have a pile of empty refrigerated containers in Los Angeles, but your customers in China need standard dry containers, those reefers are useless. You still have to reposition them because they're expensive assets, but they don't solve your shortage problem. So you're simultaneously moving empty reefers west and empty dry containers east, passing each other in the middle of the ocean. The the refrigerated container problem is particularly acute. Reefers are used heavily for food exports: meat, fruit, vegetables, dairy. These products flow primarily from agricultural regions to population centers. South America exports beef and fruit to Asia and Europe. North America exports chicken and pork. Australia exports beef. But the return flows are much smaller because manufactured goods don't need refrigeration. So reefers are constantly piling up in the wrong locations. A reefer costs about $12,000 to manufacture, more than 3 times the cost of a standard container, so shipping companies can't afford to just abandon them. But moving them empty is incredibly expensive because they're heavier and more complex. There's also the equipment substitution problem. During shortages, shipping companies sometimes use reefers for dry cargo, just to meet demand, even though the customer doesn't need refrigeration. They're essentially using a $12,000 specialized container as a $3,500 standard box. This makes the shortage worse because now that reefer isn't available for customers who actually need refrigeration, which might mean food shipments get delayed or canceled. It's a cascade of inefficiencies. Now, let's talk about the environmental impact, because this is where the empty container problem becomes truly indefensible. Shipping empty containers burns fuel and emits CO2 for zero economic value. A large container ship burns about 200 to 300 tons of fuel per day. At current rates, that's $80,000 to $120,000 per day just in fuel costs. If 40% of your containers are empty, you're essentially wasting about $30,000 to $50,000 worth of fuel every single day to transport nothing. Over a typical 14-day trans-Pacific crossing, that's $400,000 to $700,000 in wasted fuel costs per ship. Scale that across the entire global fleet, and you're talking about billions of dollars and millions of tons of CO2 emitted annually just to move empty boxes around. According to industry estimates, eliminating empty container movements entirely would reduce global shipping emissions by approximately 15 to 20%. That's equivalent to taking millions of cars off the road permanently. But we can't eliminate them because of the structural trade imbalance. So, the industry is stuck in this absurd situation where everyone knows it's wasteful, everyone knows it's polluting, but nobody can fix it, because fixing it would require fundamentally rebalancing global trade flows. Some companies have tried to solve this with technology. Digital platforms like Container Exchange and others have emerged to create marketplaces for empty containers. The idea is simple. If you're a shipping company with empty containers in Los Angeles and there's an exporter in Los Angeles who needs to ship goods to Asia, you can match them up. The exporter gets cheaper shipping rates because they're using an empty container that needs to be repositioned anyway, and the shipping company gets some revenue instead of moving it empty. Win-win, right? In theory, yes. In practice, it barely makes a dent. The problem is that the timing, location, and container type all have to align perfectly. The empty container needs to be exactly where the exporter needs it, exactly when they need it, and it needs to be the right type. The exporter needs to be shipping to a destination that works with the shipping company's route. And all of this has to fit into the ship's schedule. Most of the time, these variables don't align, so the container still moves empty. These platforms help at the margins, but they can't solve the fundamental imbalance problem. There have been more radical proposals. Some engineers have designed collapsible or foldable containers that can fold down to 1/4 of their normal size when empty. If you could fold empty containers, you could fit 4 empties in the space of 1, which would dramatically reduce repositioning costs and ship space. But these designs have problems. They're more expensive to manufacture, about $7,000 to $10,000 each compared to $3,500 for standard containers. They're less durable because the folding mechanisms add complexity and potential failure points. And they're not compatible with existing equipment, so ports would need to invest in new cranes and handling systems. So far, no shipping company has adopted them at scale. Another idea is container pooling. Instead of each shipping company owning and managing their own containers, what if there was a global container pool that everyone shared? You could pick up any container anywhere and drop it off anywhere else, similar to how bike sharing or scooter sharing works. This would maximize utilization and minimize empty movements because containers would always flow to wherever they're needed, regardless of which company owns them. But this would require unprecedented cooperation between companies that currently compete with each other. It would also create complex accounting and maintenance challenges. Who's responsible when a shared container gets damaged? How do you fairly allocate costs and benefits? Nobody's figured out how to make this work at global scale. Some economists argue the real solution is to fix the trade imbalance itself. If the United States manufactured more goods domestically and exported more to Asia, containers wouldn't pile up empty in North American ports. If Europe produced more instead of importing everything from China, container flows would be more balanced. But this requires massive structural changes to the global economy. Reshoring manufacturing, changing trade policies, rebuilding industrial capacity. That's a decades-long process, if it happens at all. In the meantime, the empty container problem persists, and it's getting worse, not better. As e-commerce continues to grow, more goods are flowing from Asian factories directly to Western consumers. This is largely one-directional traffic. Nobody's ordering container loads of products from American small businesses to be shipped to Chinese consumers. The rise of fast fashion and cheap consumer goods accelerates this trend. Companies like Shein and Temu are shipping massive volumes of low-cost products from China to the West. But there's almost nothing going back the other direction at comparable volumes. There's also a strategic dimension. During the pandemic, when shipping was in crisis, it became clear how dependent Western economies are on Asia for manufactured goods, and how vulnerable the system is to disruptions. Some governments are now talking about requiring shipping companies to maintain minimum container reserves in their countries for national security reasons. But this would make the empty container problem even worse because containers would be legally required to sit idle in certain locations instead of being repositioned where they're economically needed. The empty container problem is one of those situations where individual rational decisions create collective insanity. For each shipping company, it makes sense to move empty containers back to Asia because that's where future demand will be. But collectively, the industry is burning billions of dollars and emitting millions of tons of CO2 to move empty steel boxes around the planet because global trade is fundamentally lopsided. It's economically wasteful, environmentally destructive, and logistically absurd. But it's also unavoidable given the current structure of the global economy. So the next time you buy something online that ships from China, remember that the container it arrived in probably sailed back across the Pacific completely empty, burning fuel the entire way, just so it could be filled again with more products heading to your doorstep. That's the hidden cost of global trade that nobody talks about. 40% of the shipping industry's capacity is dedicated to moving nothing. And unless we fundamentally restructure how the world produces and consumes goods, that's not changing anytime soon. What do you think? Is there a realistic solution to the empty container problem, or is this just the inevitable cost of globalized trade? Let us know in the comments below.